Parking lot at Stanton and Briggs was the kind of place where you learned fast not to make eye contact. Not because people were unfriendly. Most of them were perfectly fine once you got to know them. It was more that everyone arrived in the same state. Coffee in one hand, phone in the other, that specific hollow look behind the eyes that comes from sleeping 5 hours and pretending it was 8. You didn't make eye contact because you didn't want to have to explain yourself before you'd even made it through the front door. I'd been an associate there for 14 months, long enough to know which elevator was slower, which conference room had the broken AC that nobody had fixed since the previous summer, and exactly how many minutes I could shave off my commute if I took the parking structure on Dalton instead of street parking. Not long enough to feel like I actually belonged there, or like the partners knew my name without having to glance at a seating chart first. That Tuesday in March, I was running on about 4 hours of sleep and the tail end of a sinus infection I'd been ignoring for 2 weeks. I'd been up until 2 in the morning finishing a due diligence memo that my supervising partner, I'll call him the senior partner I reported to because that's what he was to me then, a title more than a person, had asked for by end of day Monday. I'd submitted it at 1:47 a.m. and he'd sent back a 3-word reply, missed a section. No indication of which section. No other context. I'd found it at 2015. Fixed it. Resubmitted. Went to bed. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because by the time I walked into the lobby coffee kiosk on the ground floor that morning, I was not a person who had anything left over for anyone else. I was running on a deficit. I was the kind of tired where you start bargaining with yourself. Just get to noon, just get to the afternoon call, just get to 5 o'clock. Then you can fall apart. The kiosk in the lobby was run by a woman named Sandy who knew my order without asking by month 3. Medium dark roast, room for cream, no sleeve because I always burned my hand anyway. I got there at 8:14, which was later than I liked but earlier than the real rush, and there were 2 people ahead of me. The first was a woman from accounting I recognized but didn't know. She paid quickly and left. The second was an older man I'd never seen before. He was maybe 65, maybe older, hard to tell, compact, slightly stooped, wearing a wool overcoat that had probably been expensive 20 years ago and hadn't lost all of its dignity yet. He was holding a small paper bag along with his coffee, and when Sandy told him his total, $7.40, he patted his coat pockets once, twice, then checked his trouser pockets, and the expression on his face shifted into something quiet and mortifying. "I'm sorry," he said. "I must have left my wallet upstairs." Sandy was patient about it. She always was. But there were people behind me now, and the morning rush was starting to build, and the man's shoulders had done something that I recognized. That particular collapse that happens when a person realizes they're about to be an inconvenience in public. I don't know why I did what I did next. I want to say it was instinct or generosity or some deep moral reflex. Mostly I think I just couldn't stand watching his shoulders do that thing. "I've got it," I said, and I handed Sandy a 10 before the man had time to argue. He turned around. He had gray eyes, very steady, the kind that had probably been sharp once and still weren't slow. He looked at me for a second like he was trying to figure out what I wanted. "You don't need to do that," he said. "It's $7, I said. "Please, go ahead." He studied me for another moment. Then he nodded, once, the way someone nods when they're not agreeing with you so much as acknowledging what you did. "Thank you," he said. That was all. I got my coffee, went upstairs, sat down at my desk, and forgot about it. Genuinely forgot. The memo situation was still hanging over me. I had a call at 10, and my inbox had refilled overnight like it always did. Those emails that people send at 11 p.m. as though they're proud of being awake. The morning swallowed the whole thing whole. The rest of that Tuesday was not a good day. The 10 o'clock call ran 45 minutes over because 2 of the clients couldn't agree on evaluation methodology, and I was the most junior person in the room, which meant I was the one who had to quietly take notes while everyone else talked over each other. Afterward, one of the mid-level associates, Priya, who was brilliant and also exhausted, and those two things were related, told me I'd formatted the second exhibit on the memo wrong. Not the missing section. A different issue. The partner already noticed, she said. Not unkindly, just efficiently. I went back to my desk and fixed it and sent a revised version with a short apology note and got a red receipt, but no reply. By 3 in the afternoon, I was making the kind of small mistakes that come from pushing through fatigue, typos, a wrong cell reference in a spreadsheet, the kind of thing that feels catastrophic when you're already running behind. I stayed late to fix them. I didn't leave until 7 p.m. I'm telling you all of this because I want you to understand the 2 weeks that followed and why they felt the way they did. Because over those 2 weeks, nothing obviously changed. I still went to work. I still sat through calls. I still fixed things and got short replies or no replies and tried to figure out from context whether I was doing adequately or falling behind. The senior partner I reported to had the particular management style of saying very little unless something was wrong, which meant that if he was silent, you didn't know if that was approval or just the absence of a problem he'd noticed yet. It's the kind of feedback structure that teaches you to interpret silence as threat. I'd gotten good at it without meaning to. On a Wednesday, about 10 days after the coffee kiosk, I was eating lunch alone at my desk, which I did more often than I'd like to admit, because I hadn't figured out the lunch rhythms of the office, who ate with whom and where, and it felt easier to just stay at my desk and work. And one of the associates from the corporate group, a second year named Wilson, stopped by my desk. "Hey," he said. "Do you know a guy named Arthur Vance?" I said I didn't. "He's on the advisory board," Wilson said. "One of the founding partner's old contacts. He came in this morning for the quarterly board meeting, and he apparently asked about you by name. Just wanted to flag it." I said thank you and went back to my spreadsheet and then sat there for about 90 seconds before I pulled up the firm's website and looked up Arthur Vance. He had a bio page. 3 paragraphs, the kind that are written to be modest about a list of things that are not modest. Former general counsel at a company I had heard of. Arbitration experience going back further than I'd been alive. 3 decades in corporate law. A named endowment at a university I recognized. And a photograph in which he was wearing a suit jacket and a very quiet expression, with very steady gray eyes. I sat with that for a moment. Then I closed the tab and went back to my spreadsheet and didn't tell anyone. The reason I didn't tell anyone is that I didn't know what to do with it. There was no action item attached. He'd asked about me. That was all Wilson knew. It could mean anything. It could mean nothing. I'd learned early that the fastest way to embarrass yourself in that office was to make assumptions about your own significance. So I filed it under things that happened and tried not to think too hard about it. That Friday, the managing partner's assistant, a woman named Denise, who had been at the firm for 22 years and knew everything worth knowing, stopped at my desk and said that the managing partner would like to speak with me Monday morning at 9. She said it pleasantly. She didn't say what it was about. I spent the weekend in the mild, low-grade state of dread. That's not too dramatic. It was genuinely mild. Not the kind of dread that keeps you awake. More the kind that sits quietly in the corner of everything you do and occasionally reminds you it's there. I went for a run Saturday morning and did laundry and called my mom and watched half of something on TV, and through all of it there was this small, persistent awareness that something was coming and I didn't know what shape it would take. I'd been in trouble once before at the firm. A miscommunication about a deadline in my 3rd month that had gotten back to one of the senior partners in a way I hadn't anticipated. That had been resolved technically, but I'd never fully shaken the feeling that I was working from a slight deficit in reputation, that somewhere in the invisible accounting of the office, I still owed something I hadn't paid back. That was the thing I was mostly afraid of, walking in Monday morning. Not that something new had gone wrong, but that something old had finally caught up. The managing partner's office was on the 32nd floor. I'd been up there twice, once for my initial onboarding meeting, once for an all-associate briefing in the conference room next door. His actual office, I'd never been inside. It had glass walls on two sides and a view that on clear days went all the way to the hills, and as his assistant walked me in at exactly 9 o'clock, the light was coming in low and winter pale through the east-facing panels. The managing partner stood to greet me, which I hadn't expected. He was in his early 60s, tall with the practiced ease of someone who had been having important meetings for a very long time. He shook my hand and gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Thanks for coming up," he said, as though I'd had a choice. He asked how I was settling in, and I said I was settling in well, because what else do you say? And then he said, "Arthur Vance came in for our board meeting last week." I nodded. I tried to look like I'd already filed that away and moved on, rather than like I'd spent the weekend quietly rotating it. "He mentioned you specifically," the managing partner said. "He said you'd been kind to him in the lobby about 2 weeks ago and that he appreciated it." He paused, not for effect, I think, but because he was choosing words with some care. Arthur's been associated with this firm for a long time. He knew one of the founders personally, and he's been on the advisory board for the better part of 15 years. He doesn't come to the office often, and he doesn't typically comment on individual associates. He paused again. "He mentioned your name. He described you well enough that Denise knew exactly who he meant." I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say yet. "I wanted to meet with you," the managing partner continued, "partly because I like to follow up when a board member takes the time to say something, and partly because I realized I didn't know you as well as I should." He said this without embarrassment, which was its own thing to absorb. "I looked at your file. Your reviews from your supervising partners have been satisfactory. The memo issues in November were noted, but so was the way you handled the correction. That matters." He asked me about my background, my law school, what kind of work I was most interested in. We talked for 25 minutes. It felt less like a performance review and more like a conversation. Not a friendly one exactly, more like two people in the same field actually looking at each other for the first time. Near the end, he said, "There's a corporate governance matter coming up that I've been pulling a small team for. I'd like to include you in a junior capacity. It'll mean more hours for a stretch, but it'll also put you in front of work that most third years don't see." I said yes. I said thank you. I shook his hand again and took the elevator back down to my floor and sat at my desk and did not make any visible expression that would require explanation to a colleague. But inside I was doing something that I didn't have a good word for. Not celebrating. It wasn't that. Not relief exactly, though some of it was relief. It was more like the sensation of a door that you'd assumed was locked turning out to be just closed, and you standing there with your hand on the knob not quite believing yet that you could push it open. And then I thought about Arthur Vance in his worn overcoat, patting his pockets in front of the coffee kiosk, and the way his shoulders had started to do that thing before I said anything. $7.40. That's what I'd handed Sandy. Not even a full 10 minutes of my billable time. I hadn't thought about it since it happened. I hadn't expected anything from it. That's not false modesty. I genuinely had not thought about it again after I got upstairs that morning. Not until Wilson stopped by my desk with a name I didn't recognize. I want to be careful here because I think this story gets told the wrong way sometimes. The version I'm not trying to tell you is the one where the moral is be kind to strangers because they might be important. That's not nothing. Awareness is not nothing, but it's also not the thing I took away from this, because that version turns kindness into a strategy, and strategies have a way of eroding the thing they're supposed to protect. What I actually took away is something a little harder to package. Arthur Vance was not testing me. I don't think he went home that morning and made a call or pulled a string. I think he came to the quarterly board meeting about 2.5 weeks later and, when the managing partner asked if there was anything else, mentioned that a young associate had been kind to him in the lobby and that it had stuck with him. Maybe it stuck because he'd been having a rough morning too. Maybe it stuck because in 30 years in law, he'd learned something about how people behave when they think no one is watching. Either way, he said it. And the managing partner listened. And the thing that got transmitted in that chain wasn't a transaction. It was information about character, which is a different currency and one you can't really manufacture. I think about the associates I've worked alongside since that year, the ones who are careful about who they're kind to and when, who turn the warmth on for partners and partners' assistants and clients, and turn it off in the elevator or in the parking garage or when the coffee kiosk has a line and everyone is tired. I'm not judging them. I've done versions of that too. When you're exhausted and uncertain, you conserve, you prioritize, you decide what you can afford. What I learned in that managing partner's office, not because he lectured me about it, but just from the fact of the meeting existing at all, is that the math you think you're doing in those moments isn't the only math being done. I got the assignment on the corporate governance matter. It ran 8 weeks and it was hard, and there were several nights I was at my desk until 10 or later. But it put me in rooms with people I wouldn't have met otherwise, and it gave me a kind of experience that showed up in my reviews 6 months later in specific, citable terms. By the end of that year, I was no longer the associate the senior partners had to look up on a seating chart. I still stop at Sandy's kiosk most mornings. She still knows my order. I've gotten slightly better at the elevator. I take the North Bank now, which is consistently faster, a thing I finally figured out in month 17. Last spring, there was a woman behind me in line at the kiosk, newer face, the specific look of someone in their first or second month, still figuring out the geography of the building. She was $1 short on exact change and was starting to do the pockets check, and I handed Sandy $1 and told her not to worry about it, and I went upstairs before she had time to make a thing of it. I don't know if it will mean anything. Probably it won't. She'll have her own version of those early months, her own Tuesday morning memos and wrong-formatted exhibits, and low-grade weekend dread, and none of that is something I can fix with $1. But I also know something now that I didn't know on that Tuesday in March, with my sinus infection and my 4 hours of sleep. That the things you do when you're running on a deficit are sometimes the truest information about who you are. Because when you're depleted and distracted and not performing for anyone, what comes out is closer to the default setting. My default that morning was apparently pay for the coffee and go upstairs and forget about it. I've decided I can live with that. I've thought about that Tuesday a lot since then, not obsessively, more the way you return to a particular stretch of road after you find out something happened there that you didn't know about when you drove through it. What I keep coming back to is the randomness of it. If I'd gotten to Sandy's kiosk 3 minutes later, I would have missed Arthur Vance entirely. If I'd been having a better morning, more sleep, no memo situation, no infected sinuses making everything feel slightly underwater, I might have been in a different headspace, more self-contained, less likely to just hand over the money without thinking. There's something uncomfortable in that. The idea that a decent thing I did was partly a product of being too tired to overthink it. But I think that's actually the point. I spent a lot of my first year at that firm trying to be strategic about everything. Which assignments to take, which partners to impress, which version of myself to present in which room. That's not entirely wrong. You have to be intentional when you're starting out, when nobody knows you yet and you're trying to build something from nothing. But strategy has a ceiling. It runs out of places to reach. There are whole categories of human interaction that strategy doesn't govern, that happen too fast and too small for calculation to get involved. A line at a coffee kiosk, a man patting his coat pockets, a $10 bill. Arthur Vance didn't know who I was. He wasn't watching for anything in particular. He just noticed how someone behaved in a moment that didn't require them to behave well, and it stayed with him. That's not a trick you can replicate. The moment you start performing decency for an audience, even a hypothetical one, it stops being the thing it was. What I've tried to hold on to from that year is something I'd call the discipline of consistency. The understanding that your character isn't what you do when the stakes are clear and someone is watching. It's what you do when you're 4 hours of sleep deep into a Tuesday and the stakes are invisible and the only person watching is a woman named Sandy who already knows your coffee order. That's where the real information lives. The managing partner gave me an opportunity because Arthur Vance said something. Arthur Vance said something because of what I did without thinking. I did what I did without thinking because, on some level, it was just who I was in that moment. Depleted and distracted and still unable to watch someone's shoulders do that thing without doing something about it. I don't think that sequence was inevitable. I don't think the world runs on some ledger that balances itself out if you're patient enough. But I do think that what you practice in the small moments is what becomes available to you in the large ones. Not as a reward, more like a resource. The person you've been building in the quiet, unobserved stretches of your life is the person who shows up when it matters, and also the person who shows up when it doesn't, which is most of the time, which is where it actually counts. I still get coffee from Sandy most mornings. I still take the north elevator bank. And I still don't make eye contact in the parking lot before 8 a.m. because some things are sacred. But I try to pay attention to the moments that don't seem to matter. Because I've learned, slowly and a little accidentally, that those are often the only ones that do.